Good evening and welcome to Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 Election. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. The issues for this series, including tonight's, were selected by comparing the published platforms for the two major party candidates. For the Republican candidate, energy and environment, and for the Democratic candidate, climate change, all of which involve international relations and global reach. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. Thank you for recognizing the timeliness and relevance of these conversations. We also express our gratitude to this evening's sustaining conversation sponsor, Terracon, and supporting conversation sponsor, Janet Kennard. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Lara Vogt is the Curator of Education at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City. Opened in 1926, the museum and memorial holds the most comprehensive collection of Great War artifacts in the world and has been ranked one of the top 25 museums in the country. Under Vogt's guidance, the museum and memorial has consistently broken records for public program attendance, educational participations, and developed internationally recognized curriculum and online exhibitions. Lara, we are so glad to have you here with us this evening. Please take it away.
Oh, Matthew, thank you so very much. It is a true pleasure to be a part of this endeavor with the International Relations Council. You can't help, but when you teach about World War I, talk about politics, and one of those real key political statements that they said was to make the world safe for democracy. And at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and in particular that war memorial part, we want to teach about history, teach about politics, and do so in a nonpartisan way. As many of you may be joining us from Missouri in particular, but also from Kansas, I would invite all of you as we endeavor to make this November safe for democracy. And avail yourself of the opportunity on either October 7, 9, or 11 from 1 to 5 p.m. We will be providing notary service with curbside notary, and we will also be a polling space on November 3rd, which feels like that's no better potential commemoration for during the year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment than that. Again, Matthew, thank you so very much. And you might wonder why a curator from the National World War I Museum and Memorial might be invited to moderate on a conversation all about energy And I show you this particular image out of the archive of the National World War I Museum and Memorial. It's a photograph of a Russian cavalry in an oil field. The beauty of this visual image coming together, really showing the dawn of one age and the end of another. Energy itself, oil to be exact, was a key question during World War I. And a favorite object of mine in the main gallery is a pamphlet entitled The Commercial Future of Baghdad, published in 1917, of which the very last sentence opens, "There are rich oil fields nearby," and ends that the demands of European manufacturers for machinery and other things should be enormous. There is a tremendous amount of history to the conversation that we'll be having this evening, and I would invite you to take a look at our YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about World War I and the introduction of fossil fuels, we've got a great conversation by Brian Black. And if you want to go into a broader conversation, check out Tate Keller, who's got a great lecture and a book as well, looking at the environmental legacies of World War I. I say all of that to really emphasize that the discussion of energy, environment, and climate change and how that affects both domestic and foreign policy is not new. Leaders a century ago, as today, prioritized their political responses according to the information that they had available and its perceived impact. And I am thrilled to be introducing and to be facilitating our conversation today with Melanie Nakagawa. As you've likely already read her bio, you know that she is extraordinarily well equipped to break down the information available to us in this essential present day topic into a substantive and accessible framework for the diverse group of thinkers who are joining us this evening, and how it is going to impact international relations, foreign policy, the economy, and our future. She served on Capitol Hill for nearly a decade as the Senior Energy and Environment Counsel for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, within the U.S. State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation in the Bureau of Energy Resources, as a strategic advisor to the Secretary of State's policy planning staff to elevate climate change as a foreign policy issue. She's moved from the nonprofit sector to become an investor in technology companies around the world that are driving innovation, resilient health systems, and profitable smart cities, among other things, as the head of climate initiative with the investment firm Princeville Global. I introduce Melanie Nakagawa.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And again, thank you to everyone who is dialing in on the Zoom on this evening. And I'm just incredibly disappointed that I can't be there in person. Matthew's told me so much about what the community I would be seeing and talking to and having sidebars with. So I hope this is just as Matthew started at the beginning, a start of a conversation. I really engage, hope you use the chat function and the Q&A function, and this will be far more interesting for all of us if you submit your questions and let's have an open dialogue here. But before, just to get the fodder going and to tee up some good ideas, I thought I would just open up with just a few remarks to lay the land here across these three different types of issues that we want to be talking about tonight. And one of the things I like to do, I talk about these topics often, is I like to start these conversations reflecting on what our day would have been like today without access to certain types of environmental resources like energy and water. So on the environment side, if you didn't have access to water, how would you brush your teeth or flush the toilet or wash the dishes, which I think if you're like my household, we're doing a lot more of that these days now that we are all staying home and working from home. And, on the energy front, without the access to energy, how would we turn on our lights or open our refrigerator or power the microwave or frankly, power the electronics that you're tuning in to hear Laura and I tonight and discuss? And so it's really clear that energy and environmental issues are incredibly personal, they're local, and they're so ubiquitous to our day to day. which is why we so often forget about them or feel like they're so distant sometimes, or it's not immediately pertinent to who we are, what we do. But given that this conversation is about, our shared future, I can't think of a more pertinent shared future than the shared future we have here on this planet and on the environmental issues that we're going to discuss. So with that as sort of a level setting, sort of initial thought exercise, this is about the international component. And from the international perspective, how and why and where do we engage on these environmental and energy issues? And I'd like to just talk a little bit about where I see, the why. The why do we engage? So the why, I'll talk about three topics there. One is the cost of these natural disasters and the cost to our environment that's happening, as well as the national security implications as another reason for why we engage, and the opportunity for global leadership. And I'll also briefly talk about where we engage, specifically on energy policy and on energy issues is a key part of the where. So quickly on the why part of the equation, the natural disasters, this is something where, unfortunately, I think all of us have an experience with or know someone with experience with, to what's happening around here in the United States, but also around the world. In August alone, there were 4 what is called billion-dollar disasters. What that refers to are disasters that all in cost at least $1 billion in damages to recover from. And in August, we had 4. So far this year, we've had 14. This is on path, unfortunately, to set another, be a leading year of these natural disasters that are quite costly. But in August, it's one where we saw, widespread wildfires in California, 2 hurricanes, and then in the Midwest, something called the derecho, widespread wind damage event that caused by severe thunderstorms that really took a real toll throughout the Midwest. In particular, I saw something recently about they started to assess the damages out of Iowa, one area that was hit by this derecho, and over 10 million acres, roughly 43% of Iowa's crops were affected by the storm. And over 8,000 homes were destroyed and over 1 million people lost power due to that. And so related, this is, for Iowa itself, this is about to be a $4 billion in damages were levied. But globally, we've got 2.5 billion smallholder farmers and herders and fishers who depend on natural resources that are being affected by these extreme weather events, droughts, hurricanes, wildfires. And it's really threatening lives and livelihoods around the world. And unfortunately, as these events continue to happen with greater frequency and it's affecting livelihoods, this is also creating competition over diminished resources and intensifying global regional disputes as well. So that takes me to the second point about why we engage on these issues, which is from a national security perspective and why these environmental issues matter. As I mentioned, in some of these places where you have over 2.5 billion people that are smallholder farmers and herders and fishers, unfortunately, there's been data reported that extremist groups have actually preyed upon some of these desperate farmers in Iraq and in Syria for their campaigns. And this has been, a real challenge as we try to fight global terrorism around the world. This is just a contributing factor that's exacerbating and making it more challenging in our fight. And, taking a historical perspective, I think it's dating back to George H.W. Bush's administration in 1992. You already had at that point in time intelligence and national security professionals telling us that these environmental changes, these climate changes, were posing a direct threat to our national security. Everything from a melting Arctic to frequent droughts and flooding. These patterns were, if you look at where they were happening and you looked at a map of where there was high political instability and where there was high climate vulnerability, those areas on a map actually would line up fairly closely. And so there really was a national security, and there is a national security imperative for us to think about how we address global environmental challenges from a security framework. And as I mentioned, all things are local at the end of the day. And so even locally, our military readiness is directly affected by these challenges. The floods in Nebraska have severely damaged runways and infrastructure at the Offutt Air Force Base, which is home to U.S. Strategic Command. You saw, I think it's Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Michael's impact on Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. It caused damages to our to 17 F-22 stealth fighters and other structural damage. And you have, the stories continue on and on, which is just the physical impacts of this extreme weather and changing environment that's posing on our security, as well as broader security threats that are coming from this, is another reason why we have these global and local conversations on our environment. And then the other key piece for why is the opportunity for global leadership. There's a real opportunity here in how we think about these issues to, as a United States, put forward a global perspective of how one leads to address these challenges, how we build more resilient infrastructure, how we build more resilient systems, and how we build more resilient economies to withstand these impacts and to address these impacts. And the opportunity to take that global mantle and showcase our leadership in that area is a real reason why I have engaged on these topics, and why I believe the US should be and can be engaging on these topics. And then just to close, as part of this opening remarks, is really, where do we engage and how does one get your hands around what is both an incredibly personal and local issue, but also one that has such global and international implications as well. And the where, I think, in my mind, I like to think about it as, where can we have the most impact and where is the impact most important? And when it comes to the changes that are happening and what we can do about our environment, one of the key areas that I've been focusing my time on has been on energy and how we use energy, where we get energy, how we diversify energy. And it's pretty much a nationwide view. I mean, 38 states in our country have what we call a clean energy goal, a goal to have a certain amount of our energy coming into our state be sourced from renewable resources, clean energy resources. And I found recently that actually Kansas is number 4 in new builds for clean energy infrastructure, and is actually ranked number 9 in the country for cumulative renewable energy generation. And Missouri is actually ranked 17 in new build for clean energy as well. And that's generating around 55,000 jobs in Missouri alone for clean energy. And so the energy framework is one where it's a great opportunity for job creation. It's a great opportunity to diversify our energy resources and in our economy. And it's a great way to show leadership. If we were in person or if we had a polling function, I would ask you, which state do you think produces the most number of wind power in our country and generates more electricity from renewable sources than from coal? And I'd be curious how many would say Texas, because that's the answer. And I think it's really indicative that a state rather, that's so known for its oil and gas history is actually the state that is number 1 in our country for generating power from wind. And it's generating more from wind and solar resources than from coal. And, what's been really unique about Texas as a example or a case study is that Democrats and Republicans there both are choosing to invest in residential solar on their homes for different reasons, but they're investing in it. And the overall outcome is that it's a positive trajectory and a shift that's happening in our economy. And so one thing I'd like to sort of close this out with, at least on the energy perspective and environment perspective, is that our energy system over the last 5 plus 10 years has dramatically changed. And if you look at what Laura started out with, that first image we saw, from that moment in time, from the cavalry on horses and the oil fields, as much as our military has changed dramatically from riding horses as the mainstay, we've really changed as a country and as a planet in terms of how we're sourcing our energy and how we're sourcing our power. And power from sources like clean energy and renewable energy is increasingly overtaking the other traditional sources that we might have seen or think that is the mainstay of how our economy is run. And if we had a visual chart, I could show you just the growth of that wedge of clean energy and how it's continuing to grow and exponentially grow over time and is overtaking those other sources the same way cars and military trucks have taken over the horses that we have in our military apparatus. And so, taking a similar analogy and thinking about from perspective, I think is really important, because we really have seen a real change and a shift. And underpinning all of that has been a drive to decarbonize our economy, a drive to change the way we have grown from one that was using fossil energy and carbon polluting resources that were bad for our health, that contributed to lung cancer, premature death, in emerging markets, poor cooking fuels also had a severe impact on women in the home as well. And so we're switching from those sources and that way of powering our electronics and powering our homes to one that is more sustainable, using cleaner energy, renewable energy, and now cheaper. As an investor, that's been a primary area that we've been engaging in, which is the cost competitiveness of investing in the more sustainable energy resources is actually more economic for us to do. And we're seeing a lot of alignment around that. So that's a lot of information to put forward at the start of this conversation. But like I said, I hope this is encouraging you to formulate some questions. And Laura, let's have a discussion and make this a bit more interactive.
I really look forward to it. And I'm gonna apologize because we've got a little bit of a rainstorm going on. So if my lighting just keeps changing, my apologies. And thank you to those of you who are already adding your questions into that Q&A section. That's one of the great things about doing these virtual events. You do not have to wait until the end to add your questions in. We will certainly be addressing them. And if your question gets answered in the middle of the conversation, we won't ask it, or we will repeat and kind of needle down into a couple more details. When we spoke earlier, I was really interested in what you were discussing about these biggest economies around the world. And you just mentioned Texas, but there was another one that you mentioned as well that was really kind of leading the way in kind of some of these renewable energies. Could you speak a little bit more to that global leadership in that arena as well?
Of course, happy to. So on the renewable global space, another surprising, again, to me at times has been surprising, is the Middle East. And the fact that the Middle East, which again is when one thinks of oil and sort of fossil energy generating power, it's coming from the Middle East, and yet they are actually some of the largest investors and have set forward really ambitious plans to transition to more renewable resources. And it intuitively makes sense. I mean, when you think of the Middle East and those who have traveled to the Middle East, it's incredibly sunny. It's exactly the area where one would think you would put a massive amount of photovoltaic solar panels. But that's, it's now we're in a moment where, yes, not only is it intuitive that one would think that you would do that and it would be cost effective, but they are doing it and they set themselves on a path to do it. And part of it is because they also see this transition that's happening in our economy and the need to make this transition happen, the economics that support this transition. And frankly, it's smart business to diversify your resources from being just a solely in one basket, and that basket is continuing to diminish. And that basket is also increasingly becoming a global problem and a recognized global problem that they are now they're hedging their bets like any good business person would do and diversifying the types of resources they're investing in. So again, when you think of, emerging or currently leading in, players in the renewable clean energy space, think of the Middle East and think of Texas, which I think it's a really sort of unique perspective to realize how far we've come on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what was it, back in 1750 is when people started to think that polluted water and air was just an inevitable side effect of the benefits of industrialization. But what you are not even alluding to, you're very clearly stating is that we've got other options now, and that there are technologies and companies who are not just looking at it for climate change, but really for a long-term profit as well. One of the pieces, and we'll just go ahead and address it head on. When we talk about climate change, it can be a really polarizing topic. Can you explain how we've gotten to that place? I mean, we've known since 1750, even 1891, there were a lot of concerns that timber harvesting was impacting water supplies, which led to the US creation of our national forest system. So what is it that has taken us to this place now?
It's interesting. And as someone who's worked on these issues for decades now, you're right. In the United States, the issue of climate change can seem polarizing, because I think it comes embedded with certain perspectives of what it entails or what the actions it's going to create or drive or the impacts that'll come from it. So, that's a messaging and a communication issue that has driven some polarization around ultimately what does it mean to be for climate change or not for climate change or have to stake a position. And oftentimes what I end up doing is stepping back and figuring out what are the component parts to the climate challenge. Ignore the name climate change, but the component parts are clean air, clean water, job creation, a more stable economy. Then if everyone agrees that those are the primary objectives of what we want to achieve, then let's go after that. And I will venture to say that what we would then end up happening is we will then be delivering on our climate objectives. If you're going to go for clean air, if you're going to go for clean water, these all will then have an impact on actually decarbonizing our economy, and meeting climate objectives and meeting climate goals and climate commitments. And we're seeing that already today. But at the end of the day, climate change as a term has become a bit of a political football because people are trying to attach certain qualities to what that means. When, I really encourage, as part of this discourse and this conversation, for people to step away from that top line banner name and to again think about which candidate is putting forward plans and policies and proposals that I believe are going to deliver cleaner air, cleaner water, an economy that is going to be driven by these clean energy jobs. I mean, if you look back at the Recovery Act in 2009, over 900,000 jobs were created in the clean energy industry and the clean energy business. And today, it's actually one of the largest growing sectors of job creation is in the clean energy field. And as I mentioned, in Missouri alone, you have 55,000 jobs that are in the clean energy space. So it's there's some really great data points to point to how this truly is a clean energy creator. And don't just think about it from the US context, globally. This pandemic has really left no country untouched. And as a result, every country is thinking about their economic recovery out of the impact that this pandemic has created. And I think it's really indicative to look at the fact that all the countries around the world, if you look at how they're spending those recovery dollars and how they are prioritizing and where they're prioritizing those recovery dollars, you'll see in the majority of these packages, or majority of these countries, you'll see that clean energy, whether you call it climate change or you call it just jobs in energy efficiency, jobs in building retrofits for efficiency, which saves energy and saves money, saves landowner, saves those building owners money. All those things are baked into these recovery packages. And so it's really, to me, it just comes down to the fact that, you'll see there's this really nice alignment between how we recover, where we're investing, and the rest of the world has all embraced the notion that the rebuild and the recovery includes some element of this. Not because it's, it's a Republican or Democratic idea or what have you, but because it's actually fundamental to rebuilding our economy. This is a key and important step to do so. And that's kind of the way I would want to frame it. But, again, please, folks, let me know how you think about it, because that's, it's disappointing. It's become polarizing. And I'd love to figure out ways that we think about it from a perspective where people realize, really, what are we talking about when we say climate change?
You mentioned the pandemic. Another really easy area where we can do a comparison with World War I, where again the world was kind of set at a standstill, and people are wearing masks, and there is a time frame where people are stopping exchanges of goods, etc., after the war had ended, to try to slow the spread of a devastating virus. That shift, that slowdown in products moving back and forth, that certainly has been an influencer in our economy and our foreign policy. Another element that we've been talking about that has a World War I connection is this agreement that happened in Paris, and this has been a contentious, potentially a contentious issue. Everybody might not know what the current Paris Agreement is about, but I will say it is not the first time in US history that the US has stepped away from a global agreement that happened in Paris. And if you are knowledgeable in World War I, you will know that the United States, though we were arbiters of the Paris Peace Conference, we ultimately never signed the Treaty of Versailles. So present day, Melanie, can you help demystify what the Paris Agreement is, why it might matter, and why it has become a partisan issue?
Great, no, happy to. And I see anonymous attendee, you have asked a question on this. I will tackle your question in my response as well. So the Paris Accord, the Paris Climate Agreement that was negotiated and agreed to in 2015, is a really watershed and an important agreement for us to understand what it did and what it did and what it means and where we go from here. What it did was it brought together all the countries around the world. Over 197 parties and countries came together, and for the first time, both all 197 agreed that we are setting a global goal for our planetary warming, that will be the maximum of our planet. We're going to try to keep the warming of our planet to a 2-degree goal, 2 degrees Celsius of warming from pre-industrial levels, and we'll strive to actually hold it to 1.5 degrees. We've warmed about a half a degree to date. So there's some really interesting data out there about how much room there's left in our planetary ecosystem to warm before we have catastrophic impacts. Already today, from heat waves, wildfires, the extreme weather events I mentioned at the top of my conversation, those are, kind of real live impacts of what a warmer planet looks like. Hurricanes that are faster and more vicious and more intense is part of this warmer ecosystem is contributing to all of that. And so in Paris, the world came together and said, we agree that we need to we need to slow the trajectory on, and we need to make sure that as we continue to grow and continue to expand, our economies continue to expand, we do so in a way that does not continue to expand the emissions we're putting into the system. And to be clear, one does not need the other. One can grow an economy without having to grow their emissions footprint. It is possible. And there's so many new technologies today available to allow us to do that. And so it is possible. We have the ability to do it. And because of that, countries around the world, from small island nations to developing countries to major emerging powers like China and India to the United States and Europe, we all agreed on this premise that we can do this and we will do this. And we will set targets that we will update over time, called these Paris commitments. We'll update our Paris pledges every few years, and we'll meet those goals and we'll set new ones. But it's an iterative process. And this is what we all had agreed to do. This is under the Obama administration that this all moved forward. And then the Trump administration, a little less than 2 years ago, decided to announce the withdrawal of the United States from this global process and from this global accord. And we are the only country that is now looking to withdraw. And we will be the only country that will not be part of the agreement if we ultimately do finalize our withdrawal process. This is a conversation about the election. This is a conversation about choices. And I can't think of a more impactful choice that we all have this coming election than this choice on how we think about where we are as a global community and what we want to do about a global climate agreement. Because I say that because our withdrawal that President Trump's announced actually goes into effect on November 5th. So if President Trump wins another term, we will legally be out of the Paris Agreement. Vice President Biden has stated publicly and in his campaign platform, he will rejoin Paris as president. And so this is really where there are two roads. And it's a true fork in the road of of a decision of what that means by joining Paris or withdrawing from Paris. As someone who worked on the Paris negotiations, what it means to us, again, to bring it down to the local, something happened in Paris. What does it mean for me? How does it affect what's happening around me? And what it means for you is that because we have this umbrella architecture called the Paris Climate Accord that is driving every country who's a party to it to set forward targets and commitments to get on a smarter, cleaner, lower carbon pathway, that means your state, your city, your local municipality, the federal government is all marching in the same direction to meet these goals and these targets. What it means is that your energy mix will over time become cleaner. What it means is that the type of car you drive, you'll have more options. You'll have more options to do it where you may not have to pay for gasoline because it's being charged by a plug in the wall or a free charging station when you go to the grocery store. In the case of one company called Volta does this. So that's what it means in terms of if we join this global accord as being part of that is we are part of a community that is all moving in the same direction towards a more sustainable economy and a more sustainable lower carbon future. To anonymous attendees question, does lack of our ability to be in this accord, does it impact our ability to meet climate objectives? Yes, it does. And the reason why it does is because this global agreement is what is it's the North Star by which we're making policy decisions and regulatory decisions. And it's the North Star that we are thinking about how we want to, where we want to invest our resources to meet these objectives. And without that, we won't be doing that. So that's how I'd answer it to anonymous attendee.
That right there, you're already beginning to hit on the overarching objective of this entire lecture series, which is to make clear in a nonpartisan way the policy platforms on the ballot, and in this case, for energy, environment, and climate change. We'll go back to that question as we conclude again, if there are more more illustrations and more detail that you want to bring to both of those, but we have a really robust Q&A section right now. So I will give the next questions over to our companions in learning here this evening. Stephen Slaughter asked a follow-up question. Going along with how places like Texas and the Middle East have been investing in renewable energy, has there been ways of getting the coal belt on board?
It's a great question. So yes, there have been, in that there are really great opportunities for transitioning some of these factories and these facilities into advanced technologies and ways that they can be retooling and restructuring their existing facilities to create a different product or to be delivering a different product. There's also jobs to be created in plugging of wells. So, as I mentioned, before we started, there's this phrase that I've heard often said by many politicians and many others that the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones. And the oil age and the coal age, for that matter, won't end because there's no coal or there's no oil. It'll still be there, it'll still remain. And so there's still people that are going to have to be dealing with the legacy effects of that. And so for some of those areas, that's part of that job creation, is that they'll be plugging those wells or dealing with that. But there's also a lot of investment happening in those areas into training and new technologies and new types of skills, especially at the younger educational level, so that the children, and as they go through the schooling system, they're ready to take on jobs of the 2020 and the 2030 decade, but that they're tooled already to date to take those jobs in this new economy. For the existing players in that, there are also incentives and there's opportunities to do that for them as well. So it's a great question, because I think that's, no one wants to leave anyone behind in this process of the transition. And I think it's one where we're seeing this already to date. I mean, you see this in other countries around the world that have already started to make this transition successfully.
From Kristen McGinney, what types of government policies or initiatives are making particular places more attractive for clean energy investment?
I would say two things. So on the initiative side, I've been really impressed and excited by what large corporations are stepping up to do and act on. So you have these large announcements for, Apple to make their products carbon neutral, or, less carbon content, more recycled plastic, and their less waste in what they create and generate. You have Microsoft making commitments on their goals to be lower carbon, carbon neutral. And these all have impacts on data centers, right? And where data centers are located, with the power that's going to Amazon Web Services, that's probably powering a lot of what we have on our computers today. So these large corporations making commitments on the fleets. Amazon has made a commitment to buy electric vans for their, last mile delivery. So when you see an Amazon truck come to your neighborhood, in the future, there's a good chance it's going to be a fully electric van, and they're creating a whole ecosystem around that. And so I'm really, those initiatives by these large corporations to already drive and incentivize clean energy and lower carbon opportunities, cleaner fleets, has been a really, and that's what I think has really been distinguishing and helpful. The other piece on the policy front, you have, countries and states setting net zero targets, saying, across the board, we're not going to emit any more carbon, which means we're either going to offset it through forests and oceans and other mechanisms, or we're going to just invest in renewables and balance it out with, energy storage opportunities, or invest in other countries that need renewable energy to part of our net zero commitments. So these types of policies, I think, have been really helpful. Renewable energy policies, renewable fuel policies, these have also been propping up around the country and around the world. And as I mentioned, we have 38 states already in the US have clean energy standards in place that are having a significant effect in the types of economies and the types of jobs that are being created at home.
There are a handful of questions about alternative energies in our Q&A, and we'll start with one from David Tripp. What role do you think nuclear will play in a US or global carbon reduction priority? Nuclear has a very low carbon emissions, and new fuel blends may reduce waste handling and potential weapons grade use. That should be asked as a question, and potential weapons grade use problems.
So on nuclear, there are some incredible advancements happening with what we call small modular nuclear opportunities there, where at least with nuclear in particular, that waste issue is a significant problem and challenge, and obviously the militarization of it. So there are actually some great technologies that are still in the research and development, innovation phase, innovation stage. Some of it is funded by the Department of Energy, some of it is private sector funded. That's happening now. Right now, our economy in the US, our energy system, has a nuclear fleet, and it is a real question that policymakers are grappling with today, which is, as that nuclear fleet retires, what fills that gap, and how do we fill that massive load of power in our system that is clean energy, that is low carbon, and can we replace it with some of these smaller opportunities that don't have the waste issue, that don't have the militarization or the weapon grade weapon grade issues related to it. And I think it's very much part of the conversation. As I mentioned about the Middle East and diversification, again, my own personal view is that, diversified energy strategy is a really important strategy, as long as it is sustainable and it's cost effective and it's, environmentally sound. And we can overcome those aspects. I think it's a real possibility. And I'm happy to say that, as in my day job as an investor, we're scouring, technologies from everything from nuclear to hydrogen, green hydrogen. And we've got a great innovation ecosystem here in the United States that's generating a lot of phenomenal ideas. And so now it's a question of taking it from the idea stage to a pilot stage to the commercialization phase. We've got systems to do that, but there's definitely a potential, and I don't think any doors are closed by any means. That should be the conclusion to this, is that there are no doors closed, and there is lots of innovation happening. And again, you meet certain criteria, threshold issues, and everything's on the table.
And in that answer, you've addressed a question from Sanaya about solar and whether or not it is efficient, fastest, and cheapest versus wind farms. You've also addressed a question from Trevor about solar and other potential replacement fuels as well. Just that key seems to be diversification. Is there one that either seems, in your personal opinion, to be a larger, should be a larger sector of that diversification, or alluding to Travis Fitzwater's question, is there one that DC is seeming to lean into as a more reliable source of energy for our needs as more coal plants are retired?
So my own personal view is we should never pick winners or losers, and really let the market decide on that. And I think, beyond that sort of high level talking point response, let me get into it, which is what I mean, don't pick winners or losers, is that there are, the energy mix is not ubiquitous and should not be a one size fits all for, frankly, states, regions, countries. And so, as I mentioned, Texas is a leader. It's quite windy in West Texas. It's probably not as windy outside my home in Virginia. And so, the cost, benefit of where that resource is and where the wind blows, where the sun shines the best or is the brightest, that should drive the economics around those opportunities. And that's why I say you don't pick winners or losers, because if you pick winners, you might inadvertently prop up technologies that are not economically viable in certain areas, or you might overlook opportunities that are really viable in certain areas, but not other places. Geothermal is a great example where in really cold regions, geothermal might be a great resource to tap into, but in other areas, it's just not cost effective to do so. And so from a DC perspective, I would say there really is a focus around advanced energy and a real embracing of, generally speaking, what can we do to support an advanced energy economy, an advanced energy ecosystem? What are the tax incentives? What are the policies we can do to support overall that ecosystem? And then let them compete. Let them, let's figure out who's the best business model for New England, who's the best business model for Texas or California, and who's the best business model for Chicago or Illinois or Kansas. And that's really where, I say I really embrace multiple different types of technologies and business models, because I have yet to see a really good one size fits all work without some tweaks, because, for those who aren't energy wonks, our country is actually three different energy systems. You have an East Coast energy system, a West Coast energy system, and then Texas is actually its own energy system. And so the rules and regulations and the policymakers that are involved in those energy systems are all very different. And that actually leads to very different business models that succeed or fail throughout our country. And, the US doesn't have a nationwide federal energy policy.
Like I said, just reading the bio, it is clear that you are able to take some of these high level information pieces and really make it accessible to those of us who are tuning in. Talking about Texas specifically as its own energy space is a good transition to a question from another anonymous attendee about the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Act. That it facilitates production of oil in Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico. Should trade agreements be de-incentivizing oil and gas production?
I'm not an expert. After you gave that great explanation about myself, of course, you stumped me with this question. Let me just read it. I was looking at the other anonymous attendee question. I'll just quickly read through it. So should it be disincentivizing? So I would say on this one, I don't know if trade agreements need to disincentivize oil and gas production, because oil and gas production is already disincentivized because of the economics that are currently happening today. Really encourage those to kind of pull up the headlines from the summer where the largest oil and gas companies were having massive write-downs of their assets. These were significant headlines that, for energy wonks and others, really kind of shocked the system when it came to what's happening today in our oil and gas sector. COVID related, but frankly, a lot of these factors predated the shock that COVID delivered to the oil and gas sector space. But that, again, I think trade agreements should be incentivizing good trade policy and things that are going to be good for, our country, obviously, first and foremost, and for our partners as well. And when it comes to the oil and gas space right now, again, this is an industry that is struggling, that is seeing a need to shift. BP is, their new CEO has made a very, kind of significant call to show how BP is going to change their trajectory. They're actually self-selecting to produce less oil. That's been their latest stated claim. So I think I don't think there's a need to prescribe or be prescriptive in trade agreements to disincentivize it. Because again, trade agreements are about trade promotion. And so is it about, are we going to promote oil and gas trade? But maybe another way to frame the question. And I would say, I'm not so sure if we're going to need to promote oil and gas trade, because if that's not really what's going to be economically in our best interest, I don't think we're going to go in that direction. And we need to, bring on board the true energy experts to take a look at where they see those markets going forward and whether or not it is in our trade interest to incentivize it or frankly to disincentivize it. But either way, the market itself right now is really going through a massive upheaval, and one that's really shaking up how oil and gas is seeing their future and where they're shifting to.
As an expert in that space, and as we will leave this evenings and maybe not be gathering around the water coolers, but being engaged in conversations in other socially distanced spaces. Are there other technologies that you could speak to that are adjacent to energy that are being considered for mitigating carbon emissions?
So the ag sector is one that, I'm particularly interested in, which is how do you grow more with less inputs? So how, there are some really interesting mega trends generally happening in our world today, right? The first one being digitization. We're all on Zoom. Many of us may have downloaded, 14 different types of webinar applications, and the digitization that's happening around our country in particular, the mega trends around sensor data and what's happening on artificial intelligence. There's just so many really interesting digital trends that are happening. And one of the places where that's happening is actually at the farmer level. And there's more and more opportunities to use digital infrastructure, whether it's drones flying over land rather than having to walk that land, using satellite images and soil sampling to see what part of your farm is growing better than another part of the farm. Looking at the data of what's coming off of your crops, which part of your farm the crops were growing better or worse, what types of fertilizer seem to work better or worse in different areas. And then being able to have all that data and be able to make those decisions and those analysis to then produce more crops the next season with less fertilizer or more strategic use of water. And so and that is actually a great climate story because it's, from a drought perspective, it's helping address some of that water supply and demand challenges that we're going to see because of climate change. From a carbon perspective, how you till has a carbon impact. And so again, those types of practices can have a really positive impact on climate change. And lastly, fertilizer is actually incredibly energy intensive chemical and a process to create fertilizer. So if we're actually more strategic in how we apply it and we're using less of it, it's going to save farmers money because fertilizer is expensive, but it's also going to be a net positive for our climate perspective. So really looking at interesting ag technology or ag tech plays has been one that has a really nice climate benefit that's adjacent to the climate space. Another area is like resilient health. So air pollution sensors, air pollution monitoring. Those who live in areas anywhere in our country, will have an interest in knowing what the air quality is, whether you're in a fire zone or even if you're just you're downwind from an industrial facility, you want to know what kind of pollution's in the air. Really interested in the technologies around air pollution sensing and air quality monitoring in light of COVID, where it's a lung disease and a lung issue. This is increasingly even more important, the air quality that we breathe. And so this is another area that's an adjacent one to climate change because it's more on the adaptation side that we're excited about. And then again, outside energy, building efficiency. Those who have smart thermostats in their home that can control the energy use of the home. Those are, again, buildings buildings represent, I think, 40% of a city's carbon footprint. So being a smart user of how, these large commercial industrial building energy use is being done is really an area that has surprisingly, significant bang for your buck by being able to reduce energy use from the commercial industrial building space. So these are all areas that are adjacent to your wind farm and your solar farm, but all I would say I'd wrap in the climate technology umbrella.
And we're still getting some really great questions I am going to actually end on one that we haven't really addressed yet, and that leads into that final statement about just political platforms. It's the question from Victor McFarland that says this. Can you talk about that relationship between nonprofit advocacy groups and the government? As someone who's worked kind of in both sectors, are there what are the most important ways that groups like the NRDC have shaped the conversation on climate? And what can they do in the future, especially if there's a new administration developing a new set of climate policies?
So having worked at both NRDC and then, as someone who wrote policy on Capitol Hill and then implemented some of that when I was in the government and State Department, I would say one of the values of environmental advocacy groups or advocacy groups and nonprofits in general, vis-a-vis Washington, D.C. and Congress, was they were a great way for policymakers to get a pulse of what are constituents asking for besides the narrow world of the state constituency that they represent. And so working with a group like NRDC, I could get a sense when I was both at NRDC. I mean, NRDC at the time had, I think, 3.2 million members that were part of the NRDC network. And those members would sign on to action alerts to let Congress and policymakers know that they support, they don't want to see logging in Canada's boreal forest, or they don't want to see a certain type of porpoise that's near extinction being driven to extinction, and they want to voice their concerns about that. And so NRDC was a great, some of these nonprofit organizations were great in serving as an aggregator of people and communities that felt strongly about a particular issue and letting policymakers in DC know that there is a constituency for it. You might get, a handful of calls on the boreal forest from your constituency, but across the country, there's 3.2 million people that all care about this issue. And so that I thought was a really important role that NGOs played, was to be able to showcase not just a state-specific interest in a particular topic, but rather what are other Americans, what's the American sentiment on certain topics and certain issues, so that policymakers can factor that in as they make these policies to serve the interests of the country. So that's one where I'd say that was one where, what the value of an NGO vis-a-vis policymakers are, and what that relationship looked like when I was in government, and how I worked with them. And the way forward under this administration, if it continues, or a new administration if it continues, again, is for these organizations to, and for you all as being members of these organizations or supporting these organizations, to be part of that voice and to let these organizations share your story, be part of that voice, and to have your views and your perspectives conveyed with a lot of force, because you're doing it multiplied by tens, hundreds, millions of other voices in a sign-on letter or in calls to your member about a particular issue. And these groups can really help you develop the confidence to make that call. These groups can help you with a script of what you should say when you make this call, or who to call. Frankly, there are opportunities now where they can really give you an opportunity, like, this is your member, this is the phone number. And so that's where I think these groups have been really helpful, is letting us know which way to go. And some of them serve an expert function. They have scientists, engineers, lawyers, technology people, all in-house on staff. And so we rely on them to be just additional experts that we can consult as we write and draft policy.
Melanie, thank you all so much. My companions in learning in this conversation, thank you all as well for sharing with us in this, and sharing what is one of the rarest commodities, which is your time for a really important nonpartisan conversation about the issues at hand. Matthew, I think the last word goes to you.
Laura, thank you, and Melanie, what a treat. Thank you so much for being with us this evening and helping us to explore this truly global issue, this set of issues. Our series continues tomorrow, everyone, and we hope that you'll be able to join us then with Ambassador Frank Wisner, career diplomat, who will be talking with us about peace in the Middle East. You can get all the details you need at irckc.org. And from all of us at the International Relations Council, thank you so much, and we wish you a pleasant evening.